Hello, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Sarah Lindstrom Johnson, and I have the privilege of being um, the the PI, so in charge of the PFS CARE grant. And again, if you're new, that stands for Positive Family Support, Communities and Resilience in Education. Today, I'm going to talk to you about some of the best practices around home visits. And we'll do a few self-reflection activities on those. I am joined by my wonderful colleagues, Ana Maria Melendez Guevara, and then Ashley Previs. And so I thank them for their oversight and participation in this project. So we are funded by the Institute of Education Sciences. So we are grateful. This is the research arm of the Department of Education. So we're grateful to our funders, as well as to all of you who we get to learn from. So the objectives of today's talk are to be able to identify different strategies to systematize home visits at your school. And so I have no doubt that someone at some time has done home visits at our schools, particularly as we'll discuss in light of COVID. However, in order for home visits to be an effective strategy, there need to be processes in place through which either students are identified as needing a home visit or through which home visits become a regular part of who you are at a school. And we'll discuss some of the differences in the different types of models. And that's part of becoming familiar with the state of the research behind home visiting. So also, what do we know, as you'll see in the next point, about best practices in home visiting? And particularly, if you remember in our grant, we are really intentional about infusing a trauma-informed and a culturally responsive perspective. And so we actually feel strongly that home visiting is in line with those core values, but there are some things that you can do to be intentional and make sure that the process is maximally beneficial and comfortable for the families as well as for school staff. We'll also share some of the science of the research about how home visiting impacts students' academic and behavioral outcomes. So just a quick agenda. So welcome and introduction. So I already introduced myself and my team. If you happen to be watching this in a group, I would encourage you to take a minute and pause and introduce yourselves if you're not familiar, and maybe start the sharing process of why you've chosen to listen to today's talk. We've reviewed and we'll go through an overview, and to some extent, we're going to situate what I think of as the necessity of home visiting as a tool for schools in light of the past 2 years of our COVID pandemic. We'll run through different types of models. I'll give you some implementation tips. And then I'll give you further information about resources, and then ways to get in touch with us and our team should you have additional questions. So in light of COVID-19, last year, so we're in Arizona in case you are geographically located elsewhere, but I'm sure many schools, many states and most school systems had the same experience of having some sort of virtual schooling for last year for some sort of capacity of time. And so we happened to have a project in the field where we were working with school resource officers, as well as school social workers and school counselors. And we asked about, what did you do differently because of COVID-19, particularly in thinking about what you're going to continue in the future. And home visiting really came through as a practice that schools both identified as increasing because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also a practice that they really felt value in. And so some of these are direct quotes from that data collection. They described them as wellness visits. The team was able to conduct wellness visits for students who missed more than 2 consecutive days of school. So we also noticed a theme around absences, and that might have been in part because of the possible nature of disconnection for students, as well as concern for students' well-being broadly, but obviously as well as their safety. And then the second one, given the unique virtual start to the school year, the social worker was able to begin building relationships by conducting home visits with families. So there were definitely we're going into schools, are going to homes, we're making sure that they have all of the technology that they need. Maybe they're dropping off meals with the flexibility around the free and reduced meals, right? And the ability to deliver them to multiple families. But we also then saw this notion that out of even those wellness visits, there was a relational piece coming. And so this quote, there was an intentional desire to build relationships. So the questions kind of, I think, that schools, maybe when they catch a breath, should reflect on is, should we sustain this? What have we been doing? Has it been more around the wellness angle? Has it been about building relationship? Can it be both? And what are home visiting best practices? And so that's some of the questions we hope to help you with as we go forward. So what's the value of home visits? So I'm going to play you a little clip that actually is from NPR, and think about the value of home visits. And we're going to think about it from different perspectives, from the perspective of students, from the perspective of educators, and the perspective of families.
At a school in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, kids aren't the only ones getting on school buses. Teachers are too, and they're knocking on students' doors to introduce themselves. Blake Farmer of member station WPLN reports that these visits can be a real eye-opener for teachers and parents.
90% of students at Hobgood Elementary are growing up in low-income households. And Principal Tammy Garrett says most of her teachers don't know what that's like.
If you only grow up and you only know middle-class family, you may not understand at times maybe why they don't have their homework or why they're tired or those kinds of things.
So when Garrett became principal 4 years ago, she decided to get teachers out of their classrooms and comfort zones for an afternoon and onto a pair of yellow school buses. They're trying to get pumped up because they're doing something few enjoy, making cold calls.
Hello, it's Hobgood Elementary School.
After a few more knocks, the door to this first floor apartment cracks open.
It's Mrs. Marsh. Hi.
Many of these unannounced visits don't get beyond awkward pleasantries and handing out flyers about first of the year festivities. Some yield brief but substantive conversations with parents like Jennifer Mathis, who might be strangers around school.
I don't have a car. I can't drive because my back got broken in 2 places. I can't be there with all of it all one time.
This is the kind of real talk Principal Garrett hopes for.
You know, if a kid doesn't have a place to sleep or they have to share the couch with their siblings at night and there are 9 kids with 1 bedroom or 2 bedrooms, it's important for them to see that. Not to be sympathetic, it's to empower the teachers to change the lives of the kids.
It's serious business, but Danielle Hernandez, a special education teacher, says it's not the somber experience she'd feared. She's at an apartment complex that 50 students call home, many of them out riding bikes on their last day of summer break.
I know that these children, they go through a lot in their lives, but they get to have so much fun.
After a few minutes, teachers join in on that fun, borrowing kids' bikes for a cross parking lot drag race. The kids, too, seem to genuinely enjoy the visit, even if it is a reminder that vacation's over.
I am so lucky.
Oh, you're sweet.
I'm good. It's great to see you.
You too.
That's Shalia Stevens, the daughter of Kenny Phillips, who lets his fourth grader show off her budding social skills.
I'm just sitting back, just smiling, man. You know, it just brings you this joy, like, it makes me want to cry, man.
Phillips runs a small landscaping business and says long days keep him from being as involved in his daughter's education as he'd like to be. Seeing this interaction has him a little choked up.
It's just good to see her grow up, bro. It's good to see her grow up and have people around her who care. That's the main thing. Sometimes parents aren't there, man. Sometimes we got to work. Sometimes we're gone all the time. It's good to see, come out to the neighborhood like that, man. I know she's in good hands.
Phillips says when he was growing up, no teacher stopped by his house. He says he'll return the favor by making sure Shalia finishes all her homework this year. For NPR News, I'm Blake Farmer in Nashville.
So that was a little bit long, but I thought it was important to actually follow through the full story arc there.
At a school in Murfreesboro, Tennessee.
So if you happen to be watching this in a group, even if you're watching it by yourself, I encourage you to pause right here and think about if you have done a home visit, either similar to the model that we just heard about, or you have done something a little bit different. Think about how you felt before, how you felt after. Think about your reception in the home. Think about anything you learned. Think about anything that has surprised you. So I'll give you a moment so you can pause and reflect on this. If you're still reflecting or you're reflecting in a group, feel free to pause in general. But my guess is that many of you felt beforehand, as we heard the teacher in the video, right? I was anxious. I was dreading it, right? No one likes a cold call, right? And we'll deal with the cold call nature in a minute. That's uncomfortable, right? You're dropping in on someone you don't know. It's uncomfortable, and maybe that's okay, right? Because when things are uncomfortable, to some extent, we become more aware of our own behavior and more observant of other people's behaviors. And maybe that gives us the space and distance to make sure that we are building meaningful relationships and being mindful of establishing a foundation. My guess is, like, similar to the audio recording we heard, is that after you enjoyed it, you had some sort of reflective process. It probably depends on the purpose of the visit. And again, we'll talk about that in best practices. Sometimes in the case of a wellness check, as some of our administrators, our security resource officers or SROs describe, probably there can be a few mixed emotions depending on what the situation in the home is. Similar to your reception in the home, they describe different experiences, right? So some of the times there was just a little bit of pleasantries, but at least you maybe got to see a little bit. They call it an environmental scan. So you got to see a little bit about where your students lived. My guess is what you learned had to do more about the broader lives of your student rather than necessarily anything directly related to our parent academic support processes. And my guess is the things that surprised you. I love the end of the video when they talk about how they were pleasantly surprised, or they were surprised by the community of students and all of the fun that they were having. And I love that they joined in because I would guess similar things are found and you identify, and what surprises you is actually the strengths and the assets that the community you're visiting or the family that you're visiting has. So those are personal experiences. From the research, we have preliminary evidence. So there are actually a very few research based evaluations of home visiting models. So most of the research comes from, there was a trial in DC. So there were the school district in DC that implemented a model, or there was a school district in Dallas that implemented a model and what their outcomes said. So nothing that's necessarily that was nationwide or nothing that implemented the same exact model. But the evidence that does exist is pretty consistent that families who receive a home visit, you see greater attendance. So the students have greater attendance. You see improvements in academic outcomes, and the study that measured this actually found it with reading. So I think it was third grade reading scores improved. And improvements in positive classroom behavior. So reduced office discipline referrals, increased time on task. What was interesting is some of the studies show that some of this impact, I think it was particularly for the attendance behaviors, occurred even for students whose families didn't receive the intervention. So to me, what that tells me is that when a school had a culture of home visiting, that there was something about that culture, whether it was how the adults in the school interacted, or whether it was how the parents and the communities talked about to each other or talked about the school, made an impact for all of the students, not just those that were receiving home visits. So very, very promising preliminary research for home visiting. From the family's perspective, so I think that this is an area from a researcher's perspective that we need to better understand. But if we put our knowledge of best practices in being trauma informed or culturally responsive, I think we can really see how home visiting might be an important tool for the educators. So first is a notion of safety, right? It's there, so I have the court, right? So home court advantage, right? This is their space. Ideally, they can control the time, the place, and to some extent, the nature of the conversation that's had in this space. Who is there, how it's rolled out. So there's safety in that, right? And predominantly, a lot of that safety comes from that control, but that control also gives the family power, right? So a lot of times, not even a lot of times, the vast majority of times when we're interacting with parents in schools, we're having them come to our court, right? And particularly for families who maybe weren't educated in the US educational system, or didn't necessarily have positive experiences with the US educational system, that court is not, it's a hostile court. It's not a comfortable space and place. And so it can be particularly advantaging for families who may have had negative experiences with the school system, or who in general might have higher concerns around safety and more of a need for control of situations. And I think this is to the ultimate goal of empowering families, right? So the end of our little audio quip, they're going to pay him back by making sure that his daughter does his homework, right? We don't really want it to seem like a payback system, but what that says to me is all of a sudden you have empowered that dad to monitor his daughter's homework. And without explicitly asking, without stating that that's a need, that was a voluntary outcome. And so that's our desire, right? Our desire is for co-ownership, for families and schools to think about students' educational outcomes as a joint venture. So moving on with our culturally responsive and our trauma-informed frameworks, we have talked to, you have heard actually some of this before, is thinking about how that actually influences the communication that we have with families, right? So you see some of the same sort of terms we just mentioned, empowerment, autonomy, and collaboration, right? So when we're communicating with families in their homes, it should be around maybe not just that information sharing, but an opportunity for a dialogue, right? A 50-50 conversation split, or even ideally more than 50%, where this is really about, home visits are really about, as they seem, learning about the home, learning about the culture and the environment of the child, and the ways that the family is already supporting their development, and in turn probably or might need some assistance. And part of that is acceptance and compassion, right? So when you learn things about some of the struggles that all families face, it gives educators a chance to be human and to show acceptance and compassion for that. And that then in turn allows for those relationships. Relationships with the families, we haven't even talked about those students. And, uh, maybe there's probably some developmental differences. So, I would guess the elementary students think, having your teacher visit is like a rock star moment, where maybe your middle schoolers and your adolescents are a bit more mortified by it. But it does say something to all students of all level about their value. So I've been hinting at this, but let's talk about different types of models of home visiting and get quickly to what we know as best practices. So the first model we have is this back to school year model, right? And so all of the models that I'll present had advantages and disadvantages. And the scale kind of tips them. And so you may think that I'm implying that in this case, the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, but it depends on how much value you place on each of the advantages and disadvantages. So in the back to the school year model, a huge advantage is that it's potentially easier to set aside time. Right? So like this model, like maybe it's a professional development day. We get all of our teachers on a bus. We kind of divide and conquer our families. And we, this is what we do for a day. It's kind of like a neighborhood and environmental scan. A lot of the times at the back to school, families understand the reason, right? So, it's back to school, just reminding you that school starts. Here are those innumerable forms you have to fill out, whatever it may be. I'm your kid's teacher, families get the reason, right? And so that can be a comfort. And an advantage is that it is all students. So you'll see some of the other models might focus on students and families with specific needs, which may introduce some stigma. That being said, some of the disadvantages mimic these advantages, or the flip side of these advantages. So it is all students, right? Depending on the size of your school and the size of your faculty, it's all students. And we all know that we try to cram as much as humanly possible into the before school time, which is a busy time for educators. And a disadvantage is it's not really in response to a specific need, right? So maybe it's just that knock on the door and that really sort of surface conversation, right? And so it's a potential missed opportunity to support the family in a really identified way around a particular need for a student. So that's the back to school year model. Another model is called the specified program of visits. And so this model is probably, I would say, the most rigorous, the most intensive of models. So this model, and these are some of we'll start with the disadvantages. So it is intense, it's time intensive. So a lot of times schools not necessarily that they ascribe to kind of a community schools model, but they will have received training, sometimes compensation for a model of home visiting. And in this model of home visiting, most of the time it is all students, which can be a positive because it reduces stigma, but all students have a certain number of visits at a pre-specified time. And so this is very time intensive, but it's something that the school really buys into, that this is part of who we are. And so, parents are aware that this is a home visiting school. In our school, families receive 2 visits. Here's sort of what happens at the visit. So all of this is sort of arranged and planned and scripted in advance, with a process to make sure that that information from the home visits gets fed back, and ensured that it supports the students. So it can be very powerful. There just has to be a lot of buy-in for this sort of model. The third model is what I call the well-check visit, based on some of our work from last year. And it's kind of an ad hoc model, right? And so the well-check visit is that there's a family who has a specific need. Oftentimes we've used the well-check visit more around the students, as I mentioned earlier, students not showing up. There's some sort of family or child welfare issue. A lot of times this is the administrator or the school resource officer or the social worker. And so there's an identified student and family concern, which is wonderful, right? So the school is meeting the needs of a family. However, because it is often in the context of, I don't want to use the word crisis, but maybe a more serious situation, it's not as effective at building relationship. So this is, as it says, it's a well-check visit, right? So it's to rectify a problem, which hopefully can be a building for a relationship, but oftentimes can come across to families, if not done correctly, as being checked up on. So some of the pros and cons. However, as I mentioned, a lot of schools do this because it is less time intensive than the other models. So let's talk about best practices. So we're going to say before, during, and after. And I actually purposely wrote all of these out, even though it's a lot of words on the slide, because I wanted you to be able to use your phones and take a picture, or you have access to the slide. So I wanted you to be able to have this information to use it as you like. So before the visit, it's recommended that you schedule the visit ahead of time. So not necessarily those drop-in models, particularly because they lose the advantage of giving the family control and fostering safety. So these really should be a planned something. And part of that planning should be to communicate the purpose of the visit, the length of the visit, and who will be attending, right? So providing families information about the visit. Ideally, the timing of the visit will also be able to be negotiated with the family. Send a written reminder, paper, text, email with this information a few days ahead of time. All families are busy. All families are trying to juggle work schedules and kid schedules. So remind them so that they can be prepared. That will also decrease cancellations. You can gather information about who will be in attendance, and that's already helping you learn who's important in the child's life, or if there are family factors that at certain times of the day, certain members of the family cannot be present. Also the preferred language of the family. And we have an earlier one about working with interpreters. And so I would really encourage you, hopefully you know the primary languages that are spoken in your families and have capacity around that. But so being really mindful of the preferred languages of the family. Translators do take extra time, so make sure to arrange for a translator if necessary. And in that scheduling, allow for extra time. Some safety concern. So have directions to where you're going, so know you're going, and leave a note with the where of where you are going. So leave a note and just mention you're going to a home visit at so-and-so's house for safety and security reasons. Some schools do have policies about 2 individuals going at a time, and so that would just be something to discuss and understand your policies either at the school or the district level. and have all your needed materials. So you guys are PFS CARE schools. And so remember, we have lots of parenting brochures and worksheets on your Google Drive. But anything as well as related to the child's education or behavior, right? So have some resources gathered with, a lot of times you might have some sort of idea of behaviors that you think the child needs and want to support. And so you can have those with you. Other times it might be helpful just to have more generic things about if you have a family resource center or contact information or referrals, or anything that you want to show from your child, right? So parents may not get to come to the classroom and see the great work exemplars. And so maybe it'd be fun to bring some of those with you as well. During, be on time and dress professionally. If possible, bring a small gift with you, a child's book, little school trinkets, right? So think about it like if you were giving a hostess gift, right? So you're coming into someone's home and treating it like that will go a long way towards showing respect to the family. More respectful, be aware of and look for family customs. So is there a mat where everyone's shoes is by the door? And so you can either take your shoes off or you can ask preference, right? I see that you take your shoes off. I'm happy to do it for me. Sometimes different families will have different customs there. You can also see how the seating arrangement is and just kind of be aware. And if concerned, ask. So it's okay to this being called culturally humble. It's okay to ask about things. You're not expected to know, and asking actually can start an in-depth conversation. Begin with introductions, a little bit about yourself, small talk, but besides that, keep focused on the purpose of the visit and try to keep it into the noted time, right? And so this shouldn't necessarily be an extraordinarily long visit. So half an hour, 45 minutes would probably be a good visit length. And you're trying to do more listening than talking. And leave with an invitation for the family to visit or participate back at school, or follow up with another home visit or other way of engaging the family. And then after, send a thank you note, text, email. And it doesn't have to be anything huge. It just can be, hey, thanks. I really enjoyed getting to know you. And the more you can personalize it, of course, the better. You can add on to that any questions, referral, or resources that came up. And if there are other individuals, so if the student may have additional support, so following up on the visit with the student support team and or the teacher, I would recommend, if this is something you're intending to do, to ask for permission from the parents. That empowers them. So say, hey, I've really learned a lot that I think can help Shakira in school. Would you mind if I shared it with so-and-so? So asking permission is really important because it gives the parent empowerment. And if permission is denied, that shows that there might be an underlying something there that could be an area of future conversation. So you learn something. So discussion and Q&A. So I encourage you, we have a contact information at the last slide to reach out if you have questions. And we'll be happy to facilitate that. And hopefully, or if you're enjoying this, watching it alone, maybe grab a group of colleagues and foster some discussion together. So here are some resources. So the first resource is a report on a home visiting model. It actually does a really good job of detailing what their home visiting model was. And this was one of the more intensive models where the teachers received training and then had and home visited everyone for over the school year, but shows their outcomes, particularly on education. This is right here is a big home visiting program, but they actually have a lot of resources available for free to help structure visits. And this is a Edutopia. It's just a good website article about home visiting 101 that has a lot of those best practices that I mentioned. And same here. more of the best practices virtual home guide visits. So all of these are fairly short and user-friendly. So again, my name is Sarah Lindstrom Johnson, and we are joined today by Ashley and Anna Maria, and Marianne, who some of you have already met, is also on our team. And we can all be reached at pfscare@asu.edu. Thank you so much.